Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free tutorial today, we're going to learn how to arch set. Now this is a variation of prong setting using beautiful swooping arches of wire to hold a flat disc inside a pendant form. So my lovely friend Sissy sent me some beautiful golden coloured coins with dragons and the sorts of things that I really like on them. Now I'm not clever enough to cut coins into jewellery, unfortunately. Probably a good thing, otherwise I'd lose a finger or two. So I thought I'd find a way that you can set a coin in a way that doesn't involve any physical change to the coin. Now there are various laws around the world regarding changes to coinage that is still in circulation. So this is not a circulated coin, but it just gives you an idea of how you could hold a precious coin close to your heart if you wanted to. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look, and then I'll show you all the way through the design process of arch setting that flat coin. So here's my golden coin captured in copper, and if I want to, at any point in time, I can disassemble this and easily take the coin out, and there will be no damage to it whatsoever. So my gorgeous friend Sissy sent me a couple of these coins, and this one's got a dragon on, which is right up my street. It's got some writing on the other side, and unfortunately I have no clue what that says. So we're going to create a housing to keep this beautifully wearable. If I wanted to wear this next to my heart, I absolutely could. I'm going to be working in a really heavy wire. So this is 1.6mm or 14 gauge raw copper wire, and this length is 8 inches. So this is plenty to create a really secure surround for that coin, just to keep it nice and safe. Working with a heavy gauge wire like this can be a little bit daunting, so if you struggle with dexterity or you don't quite have that finger strength to make the form change, then do feel free to use a 1.25mm 16 gauge wire instead, and then you might like to hammer that. I'll show you the form that we're going to create. So this is what we're going to make. It looks a little bit like a pocket watch in my mind, and what I've done is I've hammered this piece and I've given it a dimpled texture on one side. Now you do need to be careful when dimpling wire that you don't actually cause it to shear through. So that's very delicate tapping. Raw copper is very good at taking that surface interruption in its stride, and on the rear side it's a little bit more of a satinized finish, and in that way I can choose which way I want to wear or display this piece. So what we're looking to do is to create a form that fits around the outside of that coin, but enables us just to open that up ever so slightly so there's a little bit of a gap. In order to create the arches, we're going to be using a 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire, so we will need to have a little bit of a shape. Now to help me create the form, what I'm going to do is use something that's very solid that I don't mind putting pressure on, that's either just slightly larger or slightly smaller than the coin itself. So I've got this bead tub and I'm just going to try to warm through this heavy gauge wire. You'll notice that it's a little bit more stubborn in changing to that beautiful fluidity than the lighter wire is. So again, you could use a slightly lighter gauge wire if you prefer. So what I'm going to do is to begin by creating a round form that is either just larger or just smaller than the coin itself. This will actually spring out a bit, so it will be significantly larger than the coin, but it gives you a start place, and it's just really to indicate that you don't need specialist tools. However, you can also use the case that the coin comes in, but it's just a little bit more difficult to show you that on screen because it's a little bit less visible. So you can use that again to help you get close to the size of that coin, and then what we're going to do is to create that pocket watch or fob watch kind of shape. So if you grab yourself some bail making pliers, they will help you to get those little loops that will need to go on the end up at the top. But what you do need to do to begin with is just to either size up or size down. If you do find that you have a round form that is just slightly smaller than your coin and you're working with a heavy wire, it might just be lucky enough to spring back into exactly the right size. But it is a case of trial and error. So I'm going to take a few minutes just to get this to fit around the outside of my coin. and then I'll meet you back for the next step in a second. It can take a little while to get that absolutely perfect. The ideal is to have a thing that is just a little bit smaller than your coin, so when you wrap that around it will simply spring back out. But once you have created that perfect facsimile of a beautiful coin shape, just a tiny bit larger, then we can move on to the next stage, which is to create those little spirals up at the top. Do take your time with this part of the process, as leaving any wiggly bits in that wire will only annoy you later. You can use any round form that you have available, but I'm going to use my multi-step bail making pliers, and I think I'm going to use step number 3. So in order to make it slightly easier to capture that flush cut end, I'm just going to prise those two ends slightly apart, and I'm going to start winding the wire around that round form. So in addition to getting the tail of the wire to sit down against the continuation of the wire, as we see just here, I'm also going to bring that upwards, which is why we needed a slightly longer piece of wire than you might imagine. So once I've got that rounded form, I'm going to pop that number 3 step back in, press down on that little bit that goes around just beyond, and I'm going to turn that over a little bit more. The reason that I want to do that is because I want to bring a slightly flattened segment into the middle, so that when we tie this all together, those coils sit proud and up above. So getting the second one done, flip that over to the other side, you might need just to play around ever so slightly with how you hold the wire to make sure that you can get everything into the correct position. So I've just estimated where I think that needs to start. I'm going to bring that all the way around. So if I just lay one of those over the top of the other, I've still got that rounded form for my coin. You just need a little bit of airspace around the edge, and you might need to take that a little bit further, or you might need to push that tail of wire around. So if I show you like so, grip firmly, push the tail of wire around. So we're going to just trial and error until we get this to sit exactly where we want it to. So I'm going to repeat what I did on the first side, which was to support the top section of that rounded form whilst I bring the wire up and away. Now if I just push that back together, if you wanted to, you can just sneak it over so that that tail holds it in position, and just check that that is still nice and round and you do still have a bit of a gap. So what I can see is that I need to take this just a little bit further over the top, so that I have the similar kind of shape to that which I have on the first side. So once I can see that I've got those two loops coming together up above the coin shape, I can trim that tail of wire away. So it's less than an inch of wire that we're trimming. And I'm just going to be very careful to only trim the tail section away, using the flush side of my cutters to make that snip. I will then use my favourite flat facing pliers just to close that up, push the tail of wire so that it sits inside the continuation of wire, and then if I need to I can just bring that slightly further round, give it a bit of a bend. So at this stage you may need to just take a few moments to reform to make sure that that does still sit in a perfect circle around the outside of the coin. If you end up with a tiny bit of a gap, don't worry about it, because we're going to tie these two loops together. Now I'm going to hammer this piece so that I can get another very similar to this. You've seen me hammering wire a heck of a lot lately, so I'm just going to be very, very quick with how I would start this off. So in order to preserve the roundness of that shape, I've made sure that it fits my coin. I'm going to start off by pressing down on either side of that. And I'll start by setting those finish points. Then I can move gradually around, and as I do so I'm going to drop that coin in multiple times to make sure I haven't disturbed the layout. So I'm not going to make you sit through all of that. I'm going to get this nice and flat and ready for use. So I finished hammering to make a really sturdy frame. that will fit around the outside of my coin. And remember, if you do accidentally mark it with your tools, with your hammer, then you can either give it a buff out with some grits, or you could add some texture to it to kind of hide that away. So if you do go a bit gung-ho, that's absolutely fine. You can hide that. So what we're going to do now is to create that arch setting. Now, a very sturdy round form is essential for this to work really easily. So I have got a 9.5mm, equivalent to 0.37 of an inch apparently, round wooden mandrel. You could use step 5 or 6 on your multi-step bell making pliers. We're also going to add in some more wire. So the wire I'm choosing to use is again raw copper, and I've cut an 18-inch length of 0.8mm 20 gauge wire. So let's just pop that coin out of the way for a moment so we don't accidentally scratch it, and we'll warm through that first section of wire. So what we're going to want to do is to put a small length over the top. I've just noticed that that isn't flush cut, so I'm just going to trim away that last millimetre or so it's nice and flush. And we're going to start around about 1/2 inch from one of those loops. If you're left-handed, you may prefer to work in the opposite direction. This is easier for me as I'm right dominant. So there's just over 1/2 inch of wire sitting over the top of that frame. And what we're going to do is to draw that all the way around to make a really good connection point. Now, if you struggle to do that by hand, then you can utilise your pliers to help you. And what we're looking for is to have what looks like 3 visible wraps. So if I just tighten those up, and then what I'm going to do is trim away that last little bit so that we're left with those 3 smooth visible wraps. What I'm going to do now is be quite brutal with that and give it a really hearty squish, but what I'm not going to do is to crush it so hard that I can't then move this from side to side. I just want to change the shape slightly so that those wraps cling to that changed wire shape. A little bit of a squish, and then tighten it up on both sides just to make sure it's neat. But you'll see that's still mobile. So what we're going to do now is to bring that all the way over to the far side. So we've got a really nice, neat connection point. Flip this around into the opposite direction. So I'm going to smooth through, if you can hear the wire on the desk, sorry about that. I'm going to smooth and warm through that first couple of inches of wire, making sure that these 3 visible wraps are nice and neat and tidy. Finer gauge wire is on the top going into the middle of our form. So I'm going to use my round form to generate an arch shape. This is very similar to how you might start off by making a dream weaver or dream catcher design. So I've got that nice little arch shape to begin with. I'm going to pinch very firmly. You could, if you prefer, leave the rod in position, but that makes it really tricky for me to demonstrate to you. So I'm going to hold that arch in position, and then I'm going to bring the tail of finer gauge wire all the way around the outside of that frame, all the way around again, and then back onto the other side. So you've only got 2 visible wraps this time. Again, I'm going to give that a little bit of a squitch, a little bit of a crunch up, but not so much that I can't move that if I need to. So my finer gauge wire is now underneath. So I'm going to bring the rod back into position, take that finer gauge wire from underneath to underneath, utilising that rod to create the form. So you can hold the rod in position. I'm going to show you on a slightly slanted viewpoint so that you can see, hopefully. Finer gauge wire is underneath the frame, all the way around the outside of the frame, and push that down all the way through the inside. Make sure that's nice and tight, and back over the top. So if I remove the rod, what we're going to do is to create a series of these arches alternating between the front or the top side of the frame and the rear or the underside of the frame. And each time you do those 2 little wraps around the frame, we're going to give that a gentle squish to make sure that it knows to hold position, but not so much that I can't then move that from side to side. And what we're going to do is go for 5 on the top, and I'll meet you back in a moment when we have that number. So I'm just about to complete the 4th arch on the front of the design. I'm going to bring that wire all the way around for a 3rd time instead of the 2 times that we've done between each of those arches. And I'm going to bring that over onto the back before I trim that last little bit of wire away. Now I do have a bit of an excess of wire, but it really does pay to have that extra, that full 18 inches, in case you wanted to go for 5 of those arches like I did in the demonstration piece, instead of the 4 that we have gone for today. So before I remove that wooden mandrel, I'm just going to give that wire a little bit of a squish, make sure that it's nice and tidy, and that I have done so on each of those double wraps between those little archways. So let's bring that mandrel out of the frame for now. So there are 2 ways in which you can make sure that your coin fits in perfectly. Because we've hammered this frame, you can ease that apart and slide it down. However, the way that I'm going to suggest doing it is actually just to move those arches down and closer together, just by pinching up until you manage to compress them so that they take up around about half of that circular form. And it can take a few moments. You can utilise your pliers to help if you've made those wraps just a little bit tight, or you can do a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, which is where you can compress these archways a little bit and also open up the frame a little bit. So what we're going to do is flip to the rear side where there are 3 of those archways. Show you that sideways, and I'm just going to pinch those very gently open at the back of the design. And that will enable us to slide the coin into position on the rear side. So if I just push that down, you can see that that really easily just slides into position. So this is going to be the rear side of the design, but obviously the coin is beautiful on both sides, so you can in fact utilise that to be seen on both sides. Once you've got the coin into position, we're just going to flip back to the front, and we're going to start moving these archways very, very softly, little by little, trying to generate or trying to keep that shape as similar as possible until it comes all the way back up to the top. You can make the archway smaller. I just used this 9.5mm mandrel because it's much easier to show you how to create the technique. What you could of course do is go for, let me just grab the smallest one. You could use a much smaller pin or mandrel. This is a 1/4 inch or 6.2mm by the looks of things, and you could go for more than 4 on the front and 3 on the back, so you would hide less of the surface of your coin. So what we're looking to do is to bring these initial wraps, the ones where there are 3 visible wraps, really close to that top section, ideally whilst keeping an even space between each of the remainder of those wraps. So you may find that you need to just reform one of those arches if it's come out of true slightly. And again, if you do struggle, you can utilise those pliers to both bring the points closer together or to sort of widen them out should you need to. What we're looking to do is to create a safe wrap and housing using those archways instead of prongs. Now, as I mentioned, I've used an oversized pin or mandrel so that it's really easy for you to see the technique. You can, of course, size that down using a skinny pencil. It does need to be a fairly firm, round form. If I flip that to the back, what we're looking to achieve here is a similar kind of distance between each of those wrap points. So it will take a few minutes just to get that all together so that it looks as beautiful on the back as it does on the front. The key here is to have on the side with fewer arches, so one side will have one more than the other. So in this example, the front has got 4 arches and on the back there are 3. We're looking for the highest point of the side with the fewer wraps to be above the halfway line. So if I just rotate this coin gently, you can see it's got a band in the middle with some text on it. And you can see by the placement of those 3 wraps that that is very much above the halfway point. By the time we have wrapped this top section together, that coin is going nowhere. One thing that you can do to just make sure is to protect your coin When you're happy with the positioning of all of those wraps that sit between each of the arches, you can move around slowly and give them each a little firm squish to ensure that that is where they stay. So this essentially is the crux of the design, and you could very easily just hang that from ribbon or chain to have that hanging on the wall as a display piece. What I'm going to do now is just to make it that little bit more secure and add another articulated bail so that you can wear that as jewellery if you want to. I mean, it's quite a flashy piece, but you never know, you might have something that's really precious to you that you just want to share with the world. So I have that scrap of wire, which was the 0.8mm or 20 gauge, which we used to create these arches, and I had a little bit left over. It's about a 5-inch length, and what we're going to do is to make sure that these 2 loops on the end of each of that rounded section just ties together nice and securely, so there's no way it can accidentally snag, pull apart and drop your precious gold coin. So what we're going to do is to just feed a section of that wire up and through. I'm going to feed around about 2 inches up through one of those loops, and what I want to do is to bar wrap these 2 loops together with 2 passes of wire. And I'm going to come into approximately the middle, so it's around about 2.5 inches I've fed through. So let's then create a nice arch form over the top and draw that down inside the other loop. You can utilise your pliers to help you if it's easier, and I'm just going to pull that all the way through. So there's a couple of ways that you can approach this. I like to get a nice handle to grab hold of, like so, and then I'm going to pull it so it's nice and tight, so that I've got a good smooth pass of wire connecting those 2 loops together. I'm going to bring the tail of wire from underneath up through the lower on your screen loop as you're looking at it. Pull that nice and tight again, and we've got a really good connection point now. So I'm going to draw that all the way through down inside the other loop and pull it across again. So the key is to get those 2 really strong bars connecting the loops together. Once you're happy that that's neat and tidy, I'm just going to flip to the rear and make sure nothing is crossing over here. So I've got 3 visible bar wraps just here. I'm going to make sure that those 2 loops are side by side. One isn't sitting on top of the other. And I'm going to give that a really firm crunch, and that kind of locks everything into position. So you can see I've got one side of the wire which is slightly longer. So I'm going to now feed that through the loop to which it is pointing. Just pull that down so that we've got our tails of wire on 2 opposing sides. And again, you can just tidy up those wraps. Make sure that the 2 end loops are sitting side by side, not one on top of the other. Give it a squish. And then what I would do, just to add a little bit of detail, is to trim that to around about 1.5 inches with the flush cutters. And then I'll just pop a spiral on either side. You grab some round nose pliers, and I'll just show you one of those really quickly, and then you can repeat it on the other side of the design. So just pick up the very end with the end of your round nose pliers, start that moving in a circular form. If you do this more slowly, it will be much neater than mine is. You've seen me run coils many hundreds of times now, I'm sure. So let's just get that all the way around. And because the wire is coming from the lowest part of that 3 wrap section, I'm going to bring that all the way down. Give it a really hearty squish and then push it flat over that segment. I'll do exactly the same thing on the other side. However, on the rear, you'll see that that wire is at the top of that 3 bar wrap section. So when I've created the spiral, I'll push it downwards so that they kind of mirror each other. It won't be exactly the same, but it will be enough. Now, in essence, you're good to go. You can pop straight into that with some chain or some jump rings, but I'm going to show you another articulated bail. I had such really great feedback from you all about the articulated bail I showed you recently that I'm going to show you another way of doing it in a slightly different fashion. So I have a 5-inch length of 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire. I would advise where possible using 1.6mm or 14 gauge, but my wrist is being a bit tricky today, so I can't quite manage that. So what we're going to do is to find the middle of that segment of wire, give it a little bit of a warm through, and we're going to start by creating a little bit of a loop. So I think that number 5 on my bail making pliers will be perfectly fine. So if I find the centre of that wire and just cross those two over to get me a nice rounded form which will act as the bail. So we've just got that central segment like so. What we're going to do then is bring one of those wires down firmly like so. And then I'm going to take the other one and wrap it around just one time. So that's all the way round once, like so. And then a half a time so that that leggy bit is sticking away at an angle at 90 degrees to that loop at the top. What we're then going to do is take the other leg of the design and spread that out to the side. Now this is a very exaggerated, broad spread. What I just want to do here is to show you that we're going to centralise that wrapped loop. Give it a bit of a squish, make sure that you're happy with how strong that is, and then we can bring both of those leggy bits down. And what I tend to do is to allow a small gap just after that wire has spread apart, bring one down on one side, allow the same gap on the other side, and then bring that second piece of wire down. So you end up with a loop that is at 90 degrees to these two pin type shapes that are coming down. Now you may need to just open those out a little bit because they are going to cross over and loop in to those big loops up at the top of the design. So just give those a little bit of a warm through, and again apologies I'm not demonstrating with the 1.6mm gauge, I just can't manage that today. Arthritis is sometimes a bit tricky like that. So this is the piece I made the other week when I was feeling a bit better, and that is indeed made with the very heavy wire, and you can see that it does form when you've got that wrist strength, but you can use that slightly lighter gauge should you need to. So what we need to do now is to create 2 loops, and you can bring those very, very softly forwards just a little bit if you need to. In fact, I think I'm going to pop my multi-step bail makers away now and grab in my favourite tools, which are the memory wire finishing pliers. These things are amazing. So what I'm going to do is to draw the wire around and bring it back forward so you end up with a loop. And then repeat exactly the same thing. You need your loops to be on the same plane, so draw that all the way around. You can also use one of those wooden mandrels, but if you pop that all the way through, you'll see that those 2 loops are even from the point of view of the hanging loop or that bail. So once you're happy that those 2 loops match up nicely, we're going to trim away any excess, and again I'm trimming about ½ inch from either side, so as long as you start with a good 5-inch length, you probably won't need to worry overly. Let's get those out of the way. Now before we attach everything together, what we're going to do is a couple of things. We're going to make sure that those loops completely finish a circuit. So actually let me just get a bit of paper underneath. So we need that cut end to meet the wire as it goes round in that circular form. So just give that a bit of a squish, make sure it sits where you want it to, exactly the same on the other side. And what we're looking to have from the front view is 2 loops that are seamless, so you can't see the cut end from the front. So you might need to just wiggle that ever so slightly over until it sits perfectly. Then it's a case of attaching everything together. So you may find that you need to just prise those 2 loops out ever so gently, making sure you don't interrupt that nice wrap that you created that holds everything together, just so that you can get those in. So if I open one way, open one the other way, it's always a bit fun getting those 2 loops in, but you should be able to get one in and then slide the other one through so that they both match up. It's just a case of wiggling that into position to make sure that they fit. There is a technique that you can do, but my brain hasn't got it in me today. I think you just open them in the same direction rather than the opposite direction. And then once they are inside those little loops at the top of your coin form, Just make sure that they close up neatly, and then from that front position that you hide the tail of wire really neatly. So you can see just here at the moment that I need to do a little bit of work on this one, just to make sure that everything sits correctly so that you can't see that cut end peeking through. Give that a squish and a squeeze and all is done. So I hope that you have enjoyed arch setting that coin with me today. As I mentioned, you could use a much smaller round form to create smaller arches, and then you'll be able to see much more of the face of that coin. I might actually take the third one, I've got a silver one somewhere, and just do that with tidgy little arches so that you can see the differences in the finished product. Thanks so much for watching and supporting me here at the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Have yourself a smashing day. Please do like the video if you've enjoyed the content. Consider sharing it on your favourite social media, pop a pin over on Pinterest, whatever floats your boat. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye for now.